So far, we've covered the death of Asa Harmon McCoy at the end of the Civil War. We've talked about the hog trial where Floyd Hatfield was accused of stealing Randall McCoy's pigs and was acquitted by a jury made up equally of Hatfields and McCoys. We followed the shooting death of Bill Staton at the hands of two of Randall's nephews, Sam and Paris, also related to Staton, and their eventual acquittal. In last episode, we watched the brief, tragic romance between John C. Hatfield and Rosanna McCoy end in heartbreak, scandal, and loss. There's been plenty of drama. But here's the thing. When most people hear Hatfields and McCoys, they imagine two families locked in open warfare, a blood feud, a vendetta. And so far, we've really only seen two deaths. One may have been a lingering casualty of the Civil War. The other was a killing between cousins. I mean, it's tragic, it's violent, but it isn't a family war. It feels a little like, pulling the cord on a lawnmower over and over again, waiting for the engine to finally catch. So what was the spark? What was the moment that transformed a collection of grudges, arguments, romances, and killings into the most famous feud in American history? Well, before we get there, let me ask you something. If we're ever going to approach what the crucial event will be to start what we all think we know about, which is this famous feud, what's the hardest thing you've ever had to forgive? Not an annoyance, not somebody cutting you off in traffic, not someone just being rude, not the crowds at Trader Joe's. I mean, something that genuinely hurt, something that stayed with you. Something unpardonable. What is forgiveness anyway? Is it a feeling? Is it a decision? Is it simply accepting what happened and moving forward? I've come to believe that holding on to a grudge gives the object of that grudge power over you. Sometimes people hurt us accidentally. Sometimes they do it deliberately. And either way, carrying that anger around often means they continue affecting our lives long after the original wound. And some people want to hold on to that grudge because they feel like forgiving them makes the slight acceptable, pardonable, makes it seem okay if that person were to do it again. And that can happen. But take a moment and understand that forgiveness isn't weakness. If anything, it can be an act of defiance. It says, you hurt me, but you don't get to decide the rest of my story. And that's where things become dangerous. Because forgiveness, vengeance, justice, they're not the same thing. Today we're going to watch the start of two families, or one, depending on how you look at it, wrestle with those ideas. And before this story is over, they'll make choices that echo for generations. Today, the feud truly begins. Welcome to episode 9 of this famous vendetta. I'm your host, Jason Hatfield. Welcome. In my family, without question, the first thing to truly create the conflict, or at least elevate it to the levels we consider the entire feud to be, began during the August election of 1882. Yes, another election. But whereas we saw love blossom in the last election, at least for a time, this one will prove to be considerably more lethal. Elections are important. And I try to impress that upon my students all the time. Who would you vote for? And more importantly, why? How can voting impact your life? Who speaks for you? Even if you don't take an interest in politics, it doesn't mean politics won't take an interest in you. I mean, we've discussed Abraham Lincoln before. Had Lincoln not been elected in 1860, South Carolina may not have seceded. If South Carolina hadn't seceded and fired on Fort Sumter, and if Lincoln hadn't responded by calling for troops, other states might not have left the Union either. And if all those events hadn't unfolded the way they did, perhaps 620,000 Americans, most of them ordinary working class backgrounds, wouldn't have died in the Civil War. Elections aren't just about the winners. They're also about how people respond when they lose. South Carolina had a choice. It could have accepted the election's outcome and worked within the democratic process, recognizing that a majority of voters had chosen Lincoln. Instead, its leaders chose secession and war. And more recently, we've seen another example of what can happen when people refuse to accept an election result. After the 2020 election, the United States experienced the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. Again, people faced a choice: accept the outcome or reject it. And Trump, let's be honest, rejected it. So life is often defined by those choices. And that's what we're ultimately talking about today. You may not like the result, but you can choose how to respond to it. Not just about elections, but just life in general, events that happen to you. You can adapt, you can organize. And in election outcomes, you can campaign, you can work to persuade others and create the change you want to see. In South Carolina's case, leaders believed that they were protecting what they called their peculiar institution, which was, of course, slavery. Ironically, by choosing war, they likely accelerated slavery's destruction by decades. And that's why choices matter, not just because of the immediate outcome of that choice, but because of the ramifications that may come long after. Now, with all that said, the events of the election we're discussing in 1882 weren't defined by national politics at all. The election of 1882 was about local issues, decided by local people. Voters cast ballots on things like road improvements, justices of the peace, and education initiatives. In mountain communities, elections weren't merely civic obligations, they were major social events. Families and friends came down from the hollows and ridges to gather. Elections were patriotic celebrations, and people sold homemade goods, shared whiskey, caught up on news, and no doubt engaged in some spirited political debates. Though, compared to today, I suspect spirited debate may have meant something a little different. Candidates and their supporters often gave stump speeches, and because many offices were held or sought by members of prominent local families, relatives would campaign on one another's behalf. Politics were personal. Family loyalties mattered. Community relationships mattered. And in a place where family connections could already run deep, elections had a way of bringing existing tensions to the surface. However, this is kind of interesting. If the words of politicians and their families didn't persuade, some candidates would even offer cups of whiskey for your vote. In more than one account I've read, the quality and kind of whiskey could be the deciding factor, more than the actual content of what the candidate wanted to accomplish in office. This may seem odd, but the concept of buying a vote or giving something in exchange for a vote being bad is relatively new. In fact, some of our founding fathers linked their political wins to giving booze to people who voted for them. In his book, Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition, author Daniel Ockrent says, quote, "When 24-year-old George Washington first ran for a seat in the Virginia House of Burgesses, he attributed his defeat to his failure to provide enough alcohol for the voters. When he tried again 2 years later, Washington floated into office partly on the 144 gallons of rum, punch, hard cider, and beer his election agent handed out, roughly half a gallon for every vote he received," end quote. Now, James Madison decided to not go that route when he first campaigned in 1777, and allegedly being the better candidate, he still lost, possibly because he was not generous. In Madison's mind, plying the constituents with liquor was abhorrent. He had a message. Wasn't that enough? Well, apparently not. And funny enough, Madison imbibed almost a pint of whiskey a day. Now, understand, these weren't just, regular drunkards or 20-something college kids tying one on. The water back then wasn't exactly the cleanest, and sometimes whiskey was added to water to help purify it, though sometimes just having a glass of something distilled could ensure its purity. And I'm not entirely sure when it became 100% illegal, but I think around since 1948, it has been illegal to reward people for voting or exchanging goods for votes. But since we mentioned spirited debates, let's get into our history. According to John Spears, a journalist who wrote the Hatfields and the McCoys, The Dramatic Story of a Mountain Feud, written in 1888, one of the candidates on this particular 7th day of August was running low on spirits and had sent for corn and apple whiskey. Unfortunately, he, quote, ought never to have sold both apple and corn moonshine, for the mixture always did and always will provoke men to wrath, end quote. I mean, it may be less than unimaginable to believe that alcohol and politics go so well together. Well, this particular election event was taking place in Pike County, Kentucky. Now, to my understanding, there were Hatfields running for office. So both Hatfields and McCoys were there, even if they weren't in the district in which they were to be voting. Now, we've discussed that the families didn't just all live in one state or the other. But there were people there who couldn't vote in this particular district, and they were there to support family. 2 individuals attending this election were Ellison Hatfield, again, brother of Devil Anse Hatfield, and a man by the name of Bad Lias Hatfield, who was the brother of Preacher Anse Hatfield. This Lias must not be confused with Good Lias Hatfield, who was like Ellison, the brother of Devil Anse. And it certainly can be noted the juxtaposition of family and names. Good Lias for the brother of Devil Anse and Bad Lias for the brother of Preacher Anse. I mean, right? Well, all families need balance, I suppose. Well, being Pike County, the McCoys were there also, as this was happening near the home of Preacher Anse Hatfield, just down the road from Randall McCoy's house. Now, as you may recall, Preacher Anse's home had been the site of the hog trial, available for rent for your next special event. The election grounds were also near his home. Of the McCoys present, Randall's son Tolbert, who had failed to bring Jauncey to jail that we heard about in the last episode, and Tolbert's brothers were there. Farmer, Pharmer, Farmer McCoy, though sometimes spelled Famer or Fanner. And there was also Randall McCoy Jr., known as Bud, and possibly even a younger brother named Bill. It's believed that Tolbert may still have been irritated at the Hatfields for his loss of an arrest of Jauncey Hatfield for either seduction or concealed weapons charges, but he had a very real grudge with Bad Lias over a debt. Apparently, Tolbert had previously sold Lias a fiddle sometime before, and in some stories they say it was just a purchase of moonshine. But whatever, Tolbert claimed that Lias still owed the balance. Lias predictably claimed to owe Tolbert nothing, as the debt had been paid. Again, is it a case of Hatfields being thieves? Or as the hog trial determined, not thieves? Words are exchanged, pushes come to shoves, a fight begins. Now, this again is where we find a split in the story. Some versions have a fight starting between Tolbert and Lias over this debt, with Anse's brother, Ellison Hatfield, coming in to break up the fight. In other versions, the fight was solely between Ellison and Tolbert. Some versions claim that Ellison was taunting Tolbert with a straw hat and Tolbert lashes out at him, while other versions claim the Hatfields were jealous that Tolbert was dancing when nobody else was. Now, I try to keep distance in these narratives to ensure what I think doesn't affect what they thought. But still, taunting a guy with a straw hat? Okay. Again, who is the antagonizer would depend on the family background of the subject and storyteller. By this point, it's family lore, despite eyewitness accounts of the event. In any case, most of the accounts claim the fight to have started originally between Bad Lias and Tolbert, and typically over the question of the fiddle debt. That's how I was always aware of it when I was growing up. And it was more than an argument, as hands were being thrown. In this contest, allegedly, Lias is beaten, going so far as receiving a, quote, sledgehammer blow to the head, end quote, though it's not ever mentioned that Tolbert actually had a hammer. I think it was just to determine the strength of Tolbert in his fight, because in many cases, Tolbert is depicted as being, a large person. At any rate, in one account, standing over the defeated Bad Lias, Tolbert loudly proclaims that he himself is hell on 2 feet. At some point, we do know for a fact that Ellison either steps in to stop the fight or is attacked. Either way, he is drawn into the fight, and he and Tolbert will come to blows. And Lias will be either knocked unconscious or stepped out of the fray. Again, accounts differ. We don't know how this officially begins. Now, when it comes to Ellison, let's revisit this man. All right, we talked about him earlier. Let's go back for a second. Ellison is the younger brother of Valentine, Uncle Wall Hatfield, and Devil Anse. He is universally considered a big man and even a Confederate veteran, as mentioned earlier, to add luster to his physique. To go beyond these descriptions, also mentioned earlier, he is typically considered to even be a hero of the Confederacy, having taken part in obviously important events in the Confederacy during the war. Perhaps he is being portrayed as having taken part in events seen as sacrificial in the cause of what the South were fighting for, despite that cause often being reinterpreted almost at the moment the South surrenders. He lives through a massive battle and the surrender of the Confederacy. But was Ellison that stalwart and faithful soldier of the rebellion? I mean, we talked about this before, but let's just review. I mean, it can be said with certainty that Ellison served in the Confederacy, as we know that from official documentation. But we also know, based on muster rolls, that he was serving in Saltville and had gone AWOL by either Gettysburg or Appomattox. So, yes, he did serve, but perhaps wasn't the last man standing either. So why the embellishing of his military career? Why is he considered to be a war hero when we know his record doesn't reflect the participation in conflicts people place him into? Again, it's not that he's not heroic. It's not that he didn't serve. We know he did. But why this elevation of his service record? I think this event will probably tell us. So we'll come back to this. Bad Lias is unconscious, or he's left. Ellison has stepped in. Tolbert's strength is sapped from his fight with Lias. And when Ellison enters, he's big, he's burly, he's fresh for the fight, and he's a force to be reckoned with. So much so that by some accounts, as Ellison's fighting, he knocks Tolbert to the ground and raises a huge rock over his head to crush Tolbert's. Or another couple of accounts from both families has him working Tolbert into a position where Ellison has the leverage in a grapple hold and that he's about to break Tolbert's neck. Rashomon yet again. At any rate, Tolbert is losing, and it looks as though he's lost, or even so much that his death is imminent. Why would Ellison have been trying to kill Tolbert? I mean, was he even trying to? Lias is his cousin. Maybe everyone's been drinking. I mean, that's probably it. At least that's how it always seems to be attributed. It's not the individual choices, but the liquor talking. It appears, however, that regardless, the fighting is going in Ellison's favor, and most accounts seem to have it that Tolbert's death was close at hand. And it's at this point, two of Tolbert's brothers, Farmer and Bud, rush in to assist. I mean, it's an election. There are people all around, one would imagine, so there are plenty of witnesses to this fight, right? When we talk of the Rashomon effect and who gets involved in this fight, how they are involved, and even their ages seem to be of dispute. Now, we know Tolbert is one of the main actors in this particular fight. He and Bad Lias were fighting over this debt, and Ellison comes in either to stop it or to defend Lias or whatever the account is. We know that Tolbert's younger brothers, Farmer and Randolph Jr., are generally accepted as the other two participants. Truda McCoy claims that it wasn't Randall Jr. or Bud, as he is commonly known, and we'll refer to him as Bud, as an assailant, but rather a Bill McCoy that took apart one of their younger brothers. And despite the number of witnesses, Bill and Bud look so much alike, Bud is accidentally accused when it was actually Bill. Now, this was a first in my research. It has generally been understood that Tolbert, Farmer, and Bud were the ones involved as I had heard it or read about it. This Bill McCoy comes forward in Truda's account, and she appears adamant of its authenticity regardless of the witnesses. Now, not having any other sources to point to Bill's involvement, I think there might actually be one other. But it's interesting that Bill is mentioned in like maybe one or two, but never considered in any of the rest of them. So we'll go with the general acceptance of the three brothers of Tolbert, Farmer, and Bud being the assailants involved, which now brings us to their respective ages. Now, Ellison is either 40 or 41, depending on his actual day of birth. Altina Waller, in her book, lists the three McCoy boys, Tolbert, Farmer, and Bud, as 28, 19, and 18, respectively. Their gravestone suggests the same, as does Truda McCoy's book, which much of this documentation may have been taken from. Now, court documents in Hatfield versus Commonwealth and Mayhorn versus Same lists them as 21, 19, and 15, respectively. And court testimony by their mother, Sarah, states Tolbert was 31 years old, Farmer was 19 years of age, and Randall was 15. So there's some disagreement about how old the sons were, except for the unanimous age of 19 for Farmer. And I'm not sure how the records are so different. For the purposes of this story, I feel like we should go with their mother's claim of their ages. Tolbert 31, Farmer 19, Bud 15. But could she have forgotten? Or are the other accounts just better researched later? It's a tough call to make. But for the sake of argument, we'll go with the common belief of 28, 19, and 18 for Tolbert, Farmer, and Bud. Just keep in the back of your mind, maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room, but according to Truda McCoy's ancestry section in her book, she lists the date that these boys were born. And those first numbers of 28, 19, and 18 seem to be the best choices. So, anyway, Farmer and Bud come to Tolbert's aid. And the three brothers fight ferociously with Ellison, grappling, punching. And once the dust settles, Ellison has been stabbed numerous times by these three brothers, and even shot once. Now, that shot tearing through the valley had to have caught everybody's attention. And it's alleged that Farmer was the one that took that shot. But what's important to note, Ellison is not dead. Now, I have questions. Would so many people have simply watched a fight? I mean, especially a stabbing and shooting? Was everyone just as drunk as those fighting, as many accounts seem to describe them? Did nobody else intervene? Did it seem too clustered to see what was going on? Did people think it too dangerous? Or was it just fun to watch? You know, like viral videos today of random fights that garner millions of views. Well, regardless, the damage is done. Tolbert's life was evidently saved by his brothers, and now Ellison faces serious wounds, miles away through the mountains from anywhere that could be considered a hospital. In a valley, in the mountains in 1882, there will be no emergency room for Ellison to be admitted. But also keep this in mind. This is well understood. Home remedies have been designed over the decades for this type of lifestyle. Sicknesses, deliveries of babies, other types of injuries had treatments. You knew where you lived and you knew how to survive, but not every injury had a cure, and Ellison's wounds would not be easily mended. They could not. I mean, by some accounts, Ellison is stabbed over a dozen times. If he were lucky, I guess, perhaps each of those knife wounds would have missed major organs, would have passed almost harmlessly in and out. But even if so, I mean, there's the pain of being repeatedly stabbed and the considerable loss of blood. So the fight begins with Tolbert and Lias until Ellison enters to break it up and Lias exits. The fight will continue with Ellison and Tolbert, and as the latter's fate is allegedly almost sealed at the hands of Ellison Hatfield, Farmer and Bud enter the fray, stabbing Ellison anywhere between, the documents say, between 12 and 27 times. And Farmer firing the shot, apparently hitting Ellison in one of his lungs. 1882. Okay, it's not like an ambulance is coming for this guy. Truda McCoy also makes the claim that Devil Ant soon arrives on the scene and grabs Farmer, who still holds the gun he shot Ellison with, and proceeds to try and shoot Farmer at point-blank range, but Farmer, continuously ducking, isn't shot. I mean, brings about visions of the Matrix, really, but... And then G. Elliot Hatfield, in his book, The Hatfields, makes the same claim, only that it was Lias who had grabbed Farmer and was repeatedly missing his shots. However, Altina Waller makes the argument that Lias was the only other direct family there and sends word to Devil Ants and Valentine about the attack. And that seems to match with later court testimony, which we'll get to later. At any rate, Preacher Ants calls for constables, who happened to be Hatfields. And these constables' names were Tolbert Hatfield, Joseph Hatfield, and Floyd Hatfield, different Floyd, who immediately take the boys into custody. I know it gets kind of difficult to sort out the Tolberts and the Floyds, but I'm here with you. I'm going to help you. So Preacher Ants calls for constables. These constables arrest the boys. Hatfield constables in Kentucky, just for the record. And then Lias runs to the wounded Ellison, who then loses consciousness. Now, I'm going to do something a little different, okay? Now, I'm going to step away from what some of the books are saying, and what follows is, it's also varied in the differing accounts written over the years. Some claim that Devil Ants takes control of events after the fight upon his arrival to the scene, going so far as to taking the brothers as prisoners from the constables who were tasked with taking the accused to Pikeville. Others dispute this, such as Rice in his book, The Hatfields and McCoys, as well as Waller's in hers, which I've talked about before, Feud, Hatfield, McCoys, and Social Change in Appalachia. So I'm going to approach this a little differently. As I'm looking into the actions and life of my great-great-grandfather, Valentine, Uncle Wall Hatfield, I'm going to now follow in his footsteps. The subsequent information is taken from court testimony and therefore has some of the more detailed descriptions of events and perhaps may be a bit more reliable. Perhaps. It appears to fit with the writings of Rice and Waller. So, 12 miles away, in what is known as the Magnolia District, at the crossing of the Tug Fork and Beach Creek on the West Virginia side, Valentine, Wall, was brought the news by one of his sons that evening about the attack on Ellison. Now, at this place, Wall was about 4 miles from home and sent for his horse, which came the next morning. With his horse came his sons-in-law, 2 men by the name of Doc and Pliant Mayhorn, brothers, and another of their brothers, Sam Mayhorn, and they set off to find out the details of whatever had happened during this fight. Being a justice of the peace, Wall had a professional interest in this matter, and being an older brother of the victim, he also had a personal one. On their way down the Pounding Mill Branch Creek, they came across another of Wall's brothers, Good Lias. Now, to remember, Good Lias was not involved in the fight. That was Bad Lias. Wall, however, immediately begins asking the questions he desperately needs the answers to, and Elias tells him for the first time who was involved in the attack on Ellison. Word must have spread by this point, and Elias has learned some details. Now, Ellison had been taken across the Tug in Logan County to the home of Anderson Farrell for medical attention. He was being cared for by Wall and Elias's mother, Nancy, and Ellison's wife, Sarah. Now, Sarah was, again, the sister of Bill Staton, who had been killed by Sam and Paris McCoy. But most importantly, Elias tells Wall that the boys have been arrested and were being taken up the creek towards Pikeville for jailing and subsequent trial. And the following actions may wind up changing my family's life forever. Wall felt that legal precedent suggested that to take the boys into Pikeville, over 25 miles away, would probably not bring about justice. Okay, by horse, it would take about 8 or 9 hours around the hills. Would you be able to get witnesses there? I mean, enough witnesses for the victim to ensure justice was served? I mean, chances are the McCoy brothers will claim self-defense as was done in Bill Staton's death. And weren't Paris and Sam acquitted? Granted, this one would be different. Unlike the death of Staton, there had to have been many, many witnesses at such an election, but those witnesses were around the valley. No, the brothers should be tried here, where the event happened. But by who? A justice of the peace wouldn't have the authority to judge a murder trial, so Valentine can't do that. But concerned for his brother and debating the actions and options, Wall does not sleep that night. He needs to find out more details for this trial and needs to get testimony from 2 other people. So he's doing an investigation, and he needs that testimony from people that may know more about the attack. Namely, 2 people he lists in his court testimony, Dr. Rutherford and another Uncle Wall Hatfield, which was possibly his uncle. They refer to him as Old Uncle Wall. Now, how they know what they may know, it's not certain. I'm not sure. Well, Elias and the Mayhorns continue and come across Joseph Davis, another guy, around the mouth of Blackberry Creek. Wall asks Davis if he saw what had happened and who had attacked his brother, and he says he did, identifying one of the boys that are in custody, and Wall thanks him, telling him, "That's all I need to know." Wall and the Mayhorns would catch up with the constables, Floyd Tolbert and Joseph Hatfield, and their prisoners, as well as Randall McCoy, their father, who was by this point accompanying them. They were moving fairly slow, having stopped off for dinner and shelter the night before at the home of Floyd McCoy. Wall negotiated with the constables. Now, this is the choice. This seemingly innocuous choice is going to change everything, okay? Wall negotiates with the constables that the boys should be brought back to the district where the crime took place, and also so that a close watch could be held over the care of Ellison, which could also determine the punishment meted out should they be found guilty. The arresting officers agree, and all return. They come across a house, place the boys on a sled, and stop for dinner at Preacher Ance's house. Again, the same location of the hog trial, near where all of this scuffle happened. Another of Randall's sons, James, comes by to figure out what is going on. Obviously, word is spreading, and there's a great deal of tension and confusion. Devil Anse and some others arrive after checking on Ellison and argue that the boys will go with them to a different location than Preacher Ance's house, which is only a little less than 3 miles down the road from Randall McCoy's, who again is also there. Ance will call his friends to fall in the line outside the house and makes it clear that the boys were going to be held under guard until Ellison's fate is revealed. He goes out there and he says, "All the Hatfields fall in the line." And everybody comes out. Apparently they get into a line. And he's like, okay, Devil Anse seems to be taking control of this. Says this is what's going to happen. So Randall immediately leaves to go to Pikeville to get legal help for his sons. James McCoy, one of the an uncle to the boys, will arrive and try to do what he can, but he can't convince the men to let the boys continue to Pikeville. Charlie Carpenter, one of those present that night, allegedly draws up laws to justify this apparent extrajudicial action that the group are taking. Devil Anse will also allegedly keep these in his possession as possible defensive measures for later. As there is no jail in this part of the valley, the closest would probably be in Logan, which is about the same distance as Pikeville and therefore would have the same conflicts of witness availability. This growing mob takes the three boys to an old schoolhouse across the Tug into West Virginia, about 6 miles from this location, from where the fight took place. The fight, according to family lore, took place in Kentucky. The victim, Ellison, and the three prisoners have now been taken into West Virginia. Now, this brings about some questions of extradition, as the parties are now crossing state lines, except that the legal authorities that have arrested the boys are still present, at least until they cross the Tug into West Virginia. The old schoolhouse will be their prison until Ellison either miraculously survives his wounds or dies from them. Wall will eventually go back to Anderson Farrell's to check on Ellison, who is miraculously still alive and in tremendous pain. He is conscious, and Wall asks him, "What do you want to happen?" Which is an odd thing, I guess, to ask. But I think Ellison was looking really bad, and they kind of wanted to know what his potential last wishes could be. And Ellison asks that the civil law take place. In other words, Ellison, even in the state he's in, wants the rule of law to preside. But it's not that easy. It never is. Hatfields are upset. Wall and Anse are emotional at the state their brother is in, and perhaps it's not best to have your captors be so close to the subject at hand. But, that being said, Ellison expressed his wish and may still pull through. We'll just have to see what happens next, as we are now out of time. Is this violent attack on Ellison the spark we've been waiting for? We'll check out our next episode. Again, you won't want to miss it. This is a two-parter. Thanks for listening. Check us out on social media. We're there. Just look for This Famous Vendetta on any of your preferred platforms. And hey, subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss a thing. Remember, we're trying to figure out the events as we know them and try to get through to the why, what, and how as best we can. We want you to be part of it. Rate us, share, and leave us a message. We'd love to hear from you. Tune in next time. And in the meantime, go out and make history in a good way. See you next time.